Hi everyone, and welcome to our bite-sized webinar today. We're looking at employment law developments in the pipeline for 2021, the key employment law issues on the HR agenda this year. I'm Tim Gilbert, a partner in the employment team here at Travers, and with me is Adam Rice, one of our Knowledge Counsel. And today we're taking a look at the off-payroll working rules. Now, these are the new rules which affect how large and medium-sized businesses engage and tax contractors. The rules came into force in the public sector back in 2017 and were due to be extended to the private sector last April. But with COVID, the rules were delayed by a year to give businesses more time to prepare, and they're now coming into force on the 6th of April this year. Now, just on timing, lots of clients are asking us, are they really coming into force, or will we have another delay? And what I'd say to that is all of the signs from government are that the rules will be coming into force on the 6th of April 2021. The legislation has been made with a 6th of April start date, and the feeling is that businesses have had an additional year to prepare. So I'd be very surprised if they were delayed any further, which means employers need to prepare now with only 8 weeks or so to go. Okay, Adam, do you want to give us a quick reminder of how the rules work?
Sure, thanks, Tim. So we've got a couple of diagrams here on the slides. The off-payroll rules will basically apply whenever you've got a worker who supplies their services through a limited company or a personal services company, what we call a PSC. Now, that's just any company where the worker has an interest in the company and where they take income which is not employment income. So typically where the worker is a director and or a shareholder of the company. And lots of contractors and consultants use this type of arrangement because it's got lots of tax advantages. But HMRC has for some time been worried about tax avoidance in this type of arrangement. So a few years ago, they introduced the rules called the IR35 rules. And the IR35 rules basically say where someone has this type of arrangement, and if you took away the PSC, the individual would look like an employee, then they should be taxed like an employee. Now, up until now, that's always been the responsibility of the worker and their PSC. But from the 6th of April this year, the responsibility passes over to the client. So it's going to be up to the client to decide whether the contractor's inside or outside IR35. And that involves asking whether without the PSC, the worker would be an employee for tax purposes. Now, if the answer is yes, then the client needs to deduct tax and national insurance from payments that it makes to the PSC as if the worker were an employee. Now, that's slightly different to the arrangement that we have here on the next slide, where there's an agency in the chain. So here the client contracts with an agency who in turn contracts with the PSC, and the PSC then provides the worker to the end client. Now, in that situation, under the off-payroll rules, the client still has to decide whether the worker is inside or outside IR35. But if the answer to that is yes, that the worker is inside IR35, then it's the agency or the fee payer who has to deduct the tax and national insurance. The fee payer is basically the body that's responsible for paying the PSC. So here the end client makes the determination whether the worker is inside or outside IR35. And if the answer is yes, the agency deducts the tax and national insurance. So that's broadly how the off-payroll rules work.
Okay, thanks, Adam. And it's worth saying at this point that the rules will only apply to large and medium-sized clients in the private sector. They don't apply to small businesses. And to qualify as small, a company needs to satisfy 2 of the following tests. It needs to have a turnover of not more than 10.2 million. It needs to have a balance sheet total of not more than 5.1 million. And it needs to have no more than 50 employees. And these tests are generally assessed on a group-wide basis rather than per entity. Okay, so let's look at some of the key considerations here. What do employers need to be doing now to prepare? Well, there are, broadly speaking, three things you need to be thinking about at this stage. First of all, if you haven't done so already, it's a really good idea to do an audit of your workers and of your supply chain to understand if you engage any workers who might be caught by these rules. And remember, the rules apply wherever you have a worker engaged through a personal services company. Your contract might be with a PSC directly, or it might be with an agency that in turn contracts with a PSC. So you may need to do a bit of digging around into your supply chain to understand how workers provide their services. And you'd want to be looking at anyone in your supply chain that provides you with labour. Secondly, where you do have contractors who are potentially caught, how will you go about making your status determinations? You have to remember the client always has to decide if the worker is inside or outside IR35. So who within your organization will do this and what tools are they going to use? And finally, once you've made your determinations, how are you going to deal with any disputes from contractors or agencies about those IR35 determinations? You're also required as an organisation to have a disputes process, and more about that a little later on.
Okay, let me pick up here on making status determinations. So as Tim said, every client in scope is required to make a status determination, and they'll need to produce a written status determination statement for each contractor they engage via a PSC. So on your status determination statement, or SDS, you'll need to set out your conclusion on whether the contractor is inside or outside IR35. And as I said, that involves asking whether, if you took away the PSC, the contractor would be an employee for tax purposes. So your statement needs to set out your conclusion, and it will also need to set out your reasons for that conclusion. Now, HMRC has produced a tool to help with this, an online tool called the Check Employment Status for Tax Purposes, or the CESS tool for short. So if you plug your details into the tool, it then spits out a response saying whether someone's inside or outside IR35. And you can actually use the output of that tool, a printout of that result, as your status determination statement. But whatever your status determination statement looks like, you need to give that to both the worker and the agency, if there's an agency that you contract with in the supply chain. Now, in terms of the deadline, with the rules coming into force on the 6th of April 2021, you'll need to issue your status determination statement before the first payment under the contract, which is after the 6th of April 2021. Now, if you've issued a status determination before the 6th of April, that's absolutely fine. It will still be valid as long as it meets all of the relevant requirements. And of course, it makes sense to issue your status determination statement as early as possible in case there is any dispute over the status.
Okay, so let's talk about the factors which are relevant to making your determination on whether someone is inside or outside of IR35. The starting point is that there is no one determinative factor, and there are quite a wide range of considerations. And these sorts of considerations are what the questions in the CEST tool that Adam mentioned are looking into. Now, the slide here sets out the key factors, and we'll just walk through them. First of all, you should look at the written contract that's in place to see how that categorizes the relationship. But of course, that only takes you so far. You'll need to look at what happens on the ground. If the practice of your worker and how they work for you differs from what is in the written document, then what happens in practice will be key. The sort of tests we're used to in the employment sphere then become relevant. How much control do you have over someone? The more control you have, the more indicative it is of employment status. Can the individual substitute workers? Allowing somebody to freely bring in workers in place of them is more indicative of self-employment. Who provides the necessary equipment? Does that come from you, or does it come from the consultant themselves? Does the consultant have the opportunity to make a profit on a set fee by efficient work, or is it simply a day rate? Again, the more prospect there is of risk or reward, the more indicative that is of self-employment. Are there mutual obligations to offer work and to accept it when offered? Mutuality of obligation is a key feature of an employment relationship. And what other benefits, what wider contractual benefits does the consultant get? Are these consistent with the idea of them being an employee or not? And how are they otherwise treated? Are they treated as though they're part and parcel of your organization, or are they presented and always regarded as being a consultant, as slightly more distant from your employment structure? The length of the relationship is important. A longer engagement will be more indicative of employment than a shorter relationship. And the intention of the parties is relevant too. But again, as with all these things, it won't be determinative. No one aspect here is determinative. And an assessment needs to be made of the full tapestry of the arrangement to form your overall view. Okay, Adam, you mentioned earlier the need to take reasonable care in making a status determination. Can we talk a bit more about what that looks like?
Yeah, sure. So I guess this is the million-dollar question: what constitutes reasonable care in making your status determination? And it's obviously going to depend on the circumstances, but there are a few pointers here on the next slide. The really important thing, I think, is that you've got a good process. So if you're going to do this in-house, you'll need to involve lots of different people, probably people from HR, recruitment, perhaps legal and finance, as well as, crucially, those parts of the business that the contractor is actually working with, who know what the contractor is doing on a day-to-day basis. Also, you'll need to decide whether you're going to use the CEST or you're going to use some other tool that's available in the market. But either way, it's going to be really important to keep good records of your thought process and any conclusions that you've reached. So how you've arrived at your status determination, what factors you've considered, and who's inputted into that process. And if you are using the CEST, it's important to make sure the information that you put into the CEST is accurate, which is why it's really important to involve those people within the business who work with the contractor, who know what they're doing on a day-to-day basis. Now, the SDS is not simply a one-time exercise, unfortunately, because we know that things can and do change in the relationship over time. So it may be that you need to review it periodically, say every 12 months or so, to make sure it's still relevant. And certainly you would need to review it and potentially update your status determination if something did change materially in the relationship before your next review. Training and support is also going to be really important. So making sure hiring managers and anyone involved in the process really understands what their obligations are and what parameters they're working within. And then finally, on reasonable care, the thing to avoid is making blanket assessments. So making blanket assessments would not be exercising reasonable care, and HMRC is very clear about that. You need to look at each role individually, or where you've got a group of very similar roles, that group of roles individually. Now, it's worth drawing a distinction here between having a blanket policy of saying we're not going to use PSC contractors at all. We're going to make sure that everybody that supplies the services does it through a fixed term employment contract, for example. Now, that's fine to have that sort of blanket policy. But what you can't do is say, if you do engage PSC contractors, simply say that they're all inside IR35 or all outside IR35. As I said, you need to assess each one on a case-by-case basis. Unless you do that, you won't be exercising reasonable care, and your status determination won't comply with the legislation.
So what if a contractor disagrees with your determination? How would they go about disputing the status determination statement?
So all clients need to have a process for responding to challenges or disagreements from the contractor. And that's one of the requirements of the legislation. There's got to be a status disagreement process. And a worker who disagrees with your assessment can lodge a challenge under that process, as can an agency. So if you contract with an agency, the agency can also invoke the status disagreement process. Now, a challenge can be lodged verbally or in writing. So you need to be aware that challenges can be made orally and be prepared to deal with those challenges as well under your status disagreement process. As a minimum, you'll need to consider any representations that are put forward by the worker or the agency, and you'll need to respond to those representations within 45 days. So there's a 45-day deadline under the off-payroll rules. In your response, you'll be saying one of two things. You'll either be saying that you've decided your original status determination is correct, in which case the original status determination statement will stand. And if that's the case, then you'll need to provide reasons why you've arrived at that conclusion. Or alternatively, you'll be saying that your original status determination was wrong, in which case you'll have to issue a fresh status determination statement, and that will need to confirm that it replaces the previous one.
So it's a bit like a grievance process or an appeals process, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And it's a good idea as a client to have some sort of policy or protocol that sets out the process that you'll follow in these circumstances. You want to make sure that contractors know who to go to if they want to make a challenge. And I would also be encouraging them to put their challenges in writing, so you're not having to deal with lots of different oral representations. Also, you want to identify within the organization who's going to be dealing with these sorts of challenges and how they're going to go about it. And just before we finish on this, it's worth saying that it's really important that these sorts of challenges don't slip through the cracks, because if you fail to consider a challenge or you fail to respond within 45 days, then that's one of the situations in which the tax and national insurance liability can pass back up to you as the client.
Okay, great. So there you have it, the off-payroll rules in a nutshell. And just to recap, there are 3 things you can be thinking about now to prepare as an organization. The first is getting a handle on your contractor population, how many contractors that you engage are likely to fall within the rules, so an audit of your labor supply. Second is coming up with a process for making your status determinations. Who's going to be responsible for this, and what process and what tools will they use? And finally, thinking about the appeals process. How will you deal with status disputes from contractors and agencies? And we've been working with a number of clients to get them prepared for the off-payroll rules, and we also have a toolkit of the key documents you'll need. So if you have any questions about anything we've covered today or need any support, please do get in touch. You can find our details on the slides and on our website. Thanks for listening, and goodbye for now.